So, in the post crusading world, there is at this point in history, sometime around the 11th, maybe 12th century, a passing of the torch, okay, in terms of the Christian world. Since the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Europe, for most of its history, even with the expansion of the Roman Catholic Church, had really kind of played second chair to Eastern Orthodox Christianity and the wealth and the power of the Byzantine Empire. But by the end of the Crusades in the early 1300s, um, Christian dominance is being expressed in Western Europe rather than in Eastern Europe. The Byzantine Empire is on the verge of collapse, while Western states are growing and on the rise. The Roman Catholic Church is wealthier and more powerful than ever, while the Orthodox Church is in decline. During this time period, there is a split within the Orthodox Church where the Rus in and around Kiev and other soon to be Russian cities branch off and create what's known as the Russian Orthodox Church, which, distinguishes them from what becomes known as the Greek Orthodox Church that remains in Constantinople. Also, post Crusades, the passage of this Arab and this Chinese and this Greek knowledge and technology into Western Europe begins a massive revival in Western Europe, especially in education and in technical innovation. In the early 11th century, you start to see the building of universities in and around these new European states. Some of the oldest in Europe being the University of Paris, the University of Oxford, the University of Pisa, the University of Milan, right? And this leads to a revival of the sciences and the study of the natural world outside of theology or the study of religion and God, which had been, for the majority of this period, really the only academic pursuit that was seen as, you know, worthy and holy by the Roman Catholic Church. Um, at the same time, Western Europe is reinforcing their economic ties to the rest of Eurasia, and this completely revolutionizes economic production. As economic production increases and as these new states form, feudalism starts to fall out of favor. Those peasants that for generations had been tied to a specific piece of land are, slowly being released from their feudal contracts. They immediately begin moving into cities. You start to see the return of the specialization of labor. And this leads to a period within a period which we know as the High Middle Ages, right? And this is going to take us right up to the beginning of the Renaissance, even though a lot of historians, don't distinguish between the two. A lot of them just say, listen, the Renaissance is just a continuation of the High Middle Ages. Um, Now, during the High Middle Ages, life in Europe not only progresses, but it begins to return to somewhat close to the level of technical and cultural achievement that they had under the Romans. Um, so, thanks to the outward expansion and the reintegration with Eurasia, Western Europe is revived. Technology is either borrowed or stolen from Asian civilizations. There's massive increases in agricultural production, things like the wheeled plow and the three field system allow Europeans to begin growing, much more food in much smaller spaces. Um, all of these newly formed states, like the Britons and the Frances, begin to build enough power and wealth to rebuild the necessary infrastructure, which allows trade to resume. It brings wealth into important cities. You start to see the emergence of very large and very wealthy city states in Italy, Venice, Florence, Pisa, Milan being some of the biggest. You also start to see major trading city states in the Netherlands and in Greece. These city states are able to pry control of the Mediterranean trade networks away from the Byzantines, further increasing the decline of the Eastern Christian part of the world. Um, in education, you see new fields and new systems of learning that start to emerge. The university system continues to develop during this time period. Um, New fields of study are introduced. Logic, ethics, astronomy become become side by side with theology and Christian dogma. Most of this is based primarily on the teachings of Aristotle, and we will talk in a couple of units about how during the scientific revolution, European scientists are forced to, in some cases unhappily, kind of bring the axe down on Aristotle, who's kind of considered the father of natural science, in order to advance education and learning in Europe. Um, Urbanization intensifies greatly during this time period. You start to see the formation of labor guilds and unions, right? Um, Workers begin to unite to demand better working conditions, more pay from their employers. Um, the practices of banking and credit are borrowed from the Muslim world, which allows for even more economic expansion. You start to see the formation of European trade networks like the Hanseatic League, right? So this chart actually comes directly from your textbook, but it gives you a good idea of the amount of cultural borrowing that goes on in Europe during these high Middle Ages and how it enables Western Europe to begin to play catch up with the rest of the world. They begin to pull themselves out of this quote unquote dark ages that they've been mired in for the past several centuries. Now, here's the thing is this revival in Europe has some pretty significant environmental impacts. And those environmental impacts are going to guide the destiny of Europeans and millions of other people over the next couple of centuries. So, with this revival come several environmental obstacles. Deforestation becomes a major problem in Europe. All of this building, all of this urbanization requires building materials, it requires fuel, and the forests of Europe decline by something like 60 to 65% over a 400-year period. Also, to feed the growing population, there is massive overfishing and water pollution, which turns the lakes and rivers of Europe basically barren. And Europeans start to push on the geographic limitations of their continent, which, if you take a look at a world map, I mean, you come to realize really quickly that Europe is far and away the smallest continent. Some would argue that it's not even its own continent, that it's just an extension of Asia. But European expansion, in order to push forward, in order to find new land and new resources, is going to have some very serious long term effects that present themselves with the colonization of the Americas within a few years. Also, reintegration into those trade networks and the end of kind of a few hundred years of isolation brings disease into Europe, disease that hadn't previously been experienced in Europe. And in 1347, the Black Death, i.e., Yersinia pestis, i.e., the bubonic plague, makes its way into Europe. And over the next 10 years, it kills between 30 to 50% of the population of Western Europe. I mean, this is probably, not probably, it is the largest mass dying in human history in terms of percentage of population. The Spanish flu of 1918, 1919 kills more people, but there were a lot more people on the planet then as well. Now, the Black Death, for its obvious, effects on the population, also is going to have long-term effects on labor in Europe. It's actually going to be beneficial for the lower classes because with such a large portion of the population now dead, labor is scarce. And the lower classes, the peasant, the merchant, and the artisan classes in Western Europe can begin to demand higher wages and better working conditions. It's also going to have a massive cultural influence, especially on the Roman Catholic Church, which we will talk about when we get to the Protestant Reformation. And then last but not least, all of this economic and cultural revival in Europe coincides environmentally with a gradual warming from the years around 750 to 900 CE. And that environmental warming enhances and intensifies the agricultural production in Europe. This feeds a continually growing population, and that continually growing population is going to have big long-term effects on migration out of Europe into Africa, into the Americas, into the Indian Ocean trade. And it's going to have a really significant effect on urbanization in Europe. You're going to start to see the growth of European cities happen at an exponential rate. They do not yet approach the size and the scope of, say, Chinese cities or the biggest Muslim cities, but small towns become large metropolitan areas within a few hundred years, thanks to this environmental change. And so that is going to set us up for the 15th century, which is coming rather soon. And this is going to introduce us to and introduce the rest of the world to the European Renaissance, European expansion, and European exploration and colonization, which is going to set the stage for the early modern and modern era.